Fame is a prison, and some legends chose to break out. What could make a star walk away from everything the world dreams of? Tonight, we're diving into Hollywood's most dramatic disappearing acts. Who were the classic icons who traded fortune for quiet shadows, and what pushed them to turn their backs on the spotlight? Stay with us, because sometimes the greatest mysteries in Hollywood aren't on the screen. They're in the stories we're never supposed to hear. Greta Garbo. Greta Garbo wasn't just a movie star. She was a living mystery, a sphinx wrapped in furs and secrets. In the golden haze of the 1930s Hollywood, no name shimmered brighter than Garbo's. With her soulful eyes and enigmatic aura, she enchanted audiences in Grand Hotel, Queen Christina, and Camille. But fame, for Garbo, was a burden, not a gift. She recoiled from the press, skipped parties, and rarely gave interviews. By the time she filmed Two-Faced Woman in 1941, she was already plotting her escape. The industry's endless demands, gossip, and studio control suffocated her. Unlike many stars who faded quietly into character roles, Garbo left at her peak, age 36, still the most desired woman in movies. She rejected every offer for a comeback, including the chance to star in Sunset Boulevard, a film about Hollywood's cast-offs. Instead, Garbo melted into the anonymity of New York City, wandering the streets alone, traveling, collecting art, and guarding her private life with a near-paranoid intensity. Photographers stalked her for decades, but the real Garbo remained out of reach, always a step ahead, refusing to let anyone see beneath the surface. To the end, she never explained herself, leaving only rumors and theories. Her retreat from fame wasn't a fall, it was a victory on her own terms, a reminder that the brightest stars can also burn the quickest, then vanish into legend. Grace Kelly. When Grace Kelly left Hollywood, it wasn't just a career change, it was a royal coup. In the span of a few short years, Kelly soared from promising newcomer to Hitchcock's darling, captivating audiences in Rear Window, Dial M for Murder, and To Catch a Thief. She won an Oscar for The Country Girl, and producers scrambled to cast her in anything that glittered. Yet behind the serene elegance and icy beauty, Kelly was plotting her escape. The Catalyst, a fairy tale meeting with Prince Rainier of Monaco at the 1955 Cannes Film Festival. Their whirlwind romance made headlines worldwide, and by 1956, the beloved actress was stepping into the role of princess, a transformation the press called the wedding of the century. But Hollywood's loss was Monaco's gain, and the price was steep. Kelly retired from acting at just 26, silencing her own legend. Directors begged her to return. Alfred Hitchcock even wrote the lead in Marnie for her, but royal protocol left no room for stardom. Rumors swirled that Kelly longed for the thrill of the set, but she never broke the rules. Instead, she turned her energy to philanthropy, raising children and shaping Monaco's image on the world stage. She was adored, but distant, always in the public eye, but never again its property. Her decision to walk away at the peak of her powers turned Grace Kelly from a Hollywood fantasy into a real-life enigma. Even in her tragic early death, the mystique only grew, leaving the world forever wondering what more she could have become. Norma Shearer. Norma Shearer's story is a quiet rebellion in the middle of Hollywood's loudest era. In the 1920s and 30s, Shearer was the queen of MGM, with hits like The Women, Marie Antoinette, and A Free Soul. She moved seamlessly from silent films to talkies, captivating audiences with her wit, sophistication, and strength. Shearer's marriage to MGM's boy wonder producer Irving Thalberg only heightened her influence. Together, they were Hollywood royalty. But when Thalberg died unexpectedly in 1936, Shearer's world shifted. The loss was profound, not just personal, but professional, as she found herself adrift in a studio system suddenly more interested in youth and novelty. Rather than fight for scraps or play roles beneath her status, Shearer made a radical choice. She retired from acting in 1942, still in demand, still a star. While others lingered in the limelight, she quietly remarried and built a life far away from sound stages and premieres. Shearer avoided interviews and public appearances, rarely discussing her film career. Her decision stunned fans, but she insisted on happiness over applause. Her privacy was not a retreat, but a declaration. Success didn't have to mean eternal exposure. While many of her peers struggled to accept fading relevance, Norma Shearer walked away with grace, dignity, and a sense of purpose. In Hollywood's history, her name remains as both a symbol of golden era glamour and the rare power to say enough. Shirley Temple. Shirley Temple was more than a child star. She was America's darling, the very symbol of hope during the Great Depression. With her trademark curls and infectious smile, she danced and sang her way into the hearts of millions in hits like Bright Eyes, Curly Top, and The Little Princess. By age 6, she was the top box office draw in the country, a feat rarely matched before or since. But the golden curls couldn't last forever. As Temple grew into adolescence, the audience's adoration began to wane. Hollywood, always fickle, struggled to accept her as anything but the cherubic child she once was. Rather than claw for relevance or chase fading stardom, Temple made a stunning pivot. She retired from films entirely at just 22. Unlike so many who floundered after early fame, she reinvented herself, marrying and focusing on family before entering public service. Temple became a respected diplomat, serving as U.S. ambassador to Ghana and Czechoslovakia and as chief of protocol. She rarely spoke of her Hollywood years, insisting on being known for her adult accomplishments. Her exit from show business was not a failure, but a second act written on her own terms. For Shirley Temple, privacy and reinvention proved the ultimate escape, and a reminder that sometimes the best role you'll ever play is the one you choose for yourself, far away from the stage lights. Cary Grant. If Hollywood had a face, it might well have been Cary Grant's. The man born Archibald Leach reinvented himself into the embodiment of suave sophistication, with a mischievous twinkle that made both audiences and co-stars swoon. He defined the leading man for an entire generation, starring in classics like Bringing Up Baby, Notorious, and North by Northwest. Grant seemed to possess everything: looks, talent, and a peerless sense of timing, whether for comedy or suspense. Yet, beneath the surface, Grant was never truly at home in Hollywood's artificial world. He kept his personal life fiercely guarded, rarely giving the press anything but polite deflection. By the mid-1960s, Grant had done the unthinkable. He left the business at the height of his fame. He turned down tempting scripts, ignored the siren call of comeback offers, and focused instead on family. The birth of his daughter Jennifer in 1966 marked the moment he stepped off the set for good. He dedicated his remaining years to raising her, investing wisely, and staying out of the limelight. Even when nostalgia for old Hollywood was at its peak, Grant refused to be lured back. His retreat wasn't bitterness. It was a final, sophisticated disappearing act, performed with the same grace and wit that defined his best roles. Hedy Lamarr. To many, Hedy Lamarr was simply the most beautiful woman in the world, a goddess captured in the shimmering light of the silver screen. But behind the glamour of Algiers, Ziegfeld Girl, and Samson and Delilah, Lamarr harbored a restless intelligence that Hollywood never knew how to handle. She dazzled in one film after another, but she loathed being treated as mere decoration. Off-camera, Lamarr tinkered with inventions, driven by a mind hungry for challenge. The studio system never fully recognized her gifts, and as the roles grew thin in the 1950s, Lamarr quietly faded away. What few knew was that her true passion lay in science. During World War II, she co-invented technology that would one day make Wi-Fi and Bluetooth possible. But accolades for her mind came late, and by then, Lamarr had already chosen privacy over applause. She lived her later years far from the limelight, grappling with financial troubles and guarding her solitude. Recognition for her inventions arrived only when she was too old to care about fame. In the end, Lamarr proved that some stars burn brightest when no one's watching, and that the mind behind the face may be the most fascinating mystery of all. Jean Arthur. There's a reason Jean Arthur was called the American Garbo. She was as famous for her shyness as for her sparkling screen presence. With her signature husky voice and unerring comic timing, Arthur won over fans in Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and The More the Merrier. Audiences loved her approachable charm, but those who worked with her knew the truth. Jean Arthur was desperately uncomfortable with fame. She avoided parties, hated interviews, and often vanished between takes. Even at her career's height, she was a ghost at Hollywood gatherings. After finishing A Foreign Affair in 1948, she left movies with barely a whisper, returning only for one final role in Shane, 1953. Teaching acting at Vassar became her safe haven. There, she inspired young performers, including Meryl Streep, without ever stepping back into the public eye. Arthur's fierce need for privacy bordered on legendary. She ignored fan mail, declined interviews, and spent her later years almost entirely in seclusion. Hollywood may have remembered her, but she preferred to forget Hollywood. In an industry built on self-promotion, Jean Arthur's vanishing act remains a statement. Sometimes, the most compelling stories are the ones left untold. Louise Brooks. In the silent era, few images were as iconic as Louise Brooks's sleek black bob and enigmatic stare. She was a sensation in Pandora's Box and Diary of a Lost Girl, her rebellious spirit electrifying the screen. But Brooks was never meant for the Hollywood machine. She despised studio rules, resisted typecasting, and openly clashed with producers. When the talkies arrived and Hollywood demanded conformity, Brooks simply refused. She would not return to America to dub her German films, even if it meant exile. The industry responded by shutting her out, and just like that, one of its brightest talents disappeared. Brooks did not beg for roles or chase comeback stories. Instead, she took odd jobs, lived modestly, and watched as her contemporaries fought to stay relevant. For decades, she lived in near obscurity, ignored by the business that once chased her. Only in the 1950s did film historians rediscover her artistry, but Brooks never sought their approval. Her later years were spent writing frank, unflinching accounts of her time in Hollywood, refusing to sugarcoat the industry's betrayals. Louise Brooks became a cult legend, not because she stayed in the game, but because she was one of the few who walked away with her integrity and her secrets intact. Margaret Sullivan. In a town built on fantasy, Margaret Sullivan's career was grounded in reality, sometimes heartbreakingly so. She was never Hollywood's loudest star, but her performances in The Shop Around the Corner, Three Comrades, and The Mortal Storm were infused with a vulnerability that made her unforgettable. Sullivan arrived in Hollywood from the stage, and she never truly let go of her theatrical roots. Her unique voice and natural style stood apart from the mannered affectations of her era, but fame never sat comfortably on her shoulders. She resisted typecasting and was unafraid to challenge powerful studio heads, demanding roles that respected her intelligence. Unlike other actresses, Sullivan never played the game for headlines or easy adoration. Instead, she fought for nuanced characters, often clashing with producers over the direction of her roles. But beneath the poise and determination was a woman growing weary of the business, the endless publicity, the unrelenting pressure to stay relevant, and the personal toll of keeping up appearances. By the mid-1940s, plagued by worsening hearing loss and long-standing depression, Sullivan knew she needed peace more than applause. After filming No Sad Songs for Me in 1950, she quietly retreated from movies and the artificiality of Hollywood life. She sought meaning in her family, found occasional comfort in the stage, and turned her focus inward for private reflection. Unlike so many of her peers, Sullivan never attempted a comeback. She left her audience with a sense of graceful absence, proving that some stories are richer and more dignified when they end on a quiet note, rather than a final bow. Anne Harding. Anne Harding's Hollywood journey was almost accidental, a detour for a woman who belonged on the stage, not under the studio's thumb. With films like Holiday, The Animal Kingdom, and East Lynne, Harding's refined presence and emotional intelligence set her apart in a crowded field. She quickly became known for her sophisticated performances, but stardom was never her ambition. For Harding, acting was a craft, not a calling to endless publicity. She found Hollywood's rigid system stifling and its demands on her personal life unbearable. Unlike stars desperate for magazine covers and red carpets, Harding yearned for simplicity and control. In 1937, at the top of her game, she shocked the industry by walking away. She married conductor Werner Janssen and left Los Angeles, choosing love and tranquility over contracts and fanfare. Though she would occasionally return for select roles, it was always on her own terms and far from the frantic world of major studio productions. Harding's story is rarely told alongside Hollywood's most famous escape artists, but her path was one of quiet defiance, a refusal to let the business define her. To this day, Anne Harding stands as a reminder that a fulfilling life can start only after the curtain falls. Deanna Durbin. For millions, Deanna Durbin was the voice of hope during the darkest days of the 1930s and 40s. Her luminous soprano and wholesome charm made her one of Universal's biggest stars, rescuing the studio from financial ruin with hits like Three Smart Girls and It Started with Eve. She was America's singing sweetheart, idolized by fans, courted by producers, and pursued relentlessly by the press. But behind the scenes, Durbin was chafing under the pressures of stardom. Studio bosses tried to control her image, dictating every detail from her scripts to her love life. The price of fame soon became too high. At only 27, at the peak of her popularity, Durbin made an extraordinary choice. She quit movies for good. She moved to France, married, and faded into private life, refusing interviews and declining even the most lucrative comeback offers. For decades, her silence became legend. Reporters traveled across continents to find her, but Durbin was resolute. She had sung her last song for Hollywood. Her disappearance from the public eye remains one of the industry's great mysteries, proof that some stars are willing to trade applause for true peace. In the end, Deanna Durbin's happiest years were the ones she spent out of the spotlight, living on her own terms. Barbara Loden. Barbara Loden's Hollywood story is a study in contrasts, flickering briefly in the spotlight before seeking her own creative shadows. Loden began as a model and stage actress, making her mark with a Tony-winning role and a quietly haunting presence in films like Splendor in the Grass. But Hollywood, with its rigid hierarchies and narrow definitions of success, never seemed to know what to do with her. Loden bristled at the limitations placed on women, especially those who refused to play by the rules. Her answer was Wanda, 1970, a film she wrote, directed, and starred in, a raw, unflinching portrait of alienation and escape that critics would one day hail as a masterpiece. But the industry wasn't ready for her vision, and instead of chasing further fame, Loden stepped back from the public eye. She turned down interviews, kept her private life shielded from prying cameras, and poured herself into directing and family. The world barely noticed her withdrawal, but those who study film know her as a pioneer, a woman who fled the spotlight not out of defeat, but to create art on her own terms. Barbara Loden's disappearance from fame is a quiet, powerful footnote in Hollywood history, proof that some legacies grow even larger in the dark. Bobby Driscoll. For a fleeting moment in the late 1940s and early 1950s, Bobby Driscoll was the very definition of Hollywood's golden child. His soulful eyes and innocence brought to life classics like Song of the South, Treasure Island, and most famously, the voice of Disney's Peter Pan. He was the youngest ever to win a special juvenile Oscar, a symbol of America's love affair with its child stars. But as the years passed and Driscoll's features sharpened into adolescence, Hollywood's warmth turned cold. Disney Studios, the very company that had built him up, quietly let his contract expire. The transition from child actor to adult proved brutal, and Driscoll found doors that once swung open now locked tight. Desperate for anonymity, he drifted away from the studios, tried his hand at painting and poetry, and avoided the press. His final years were marked by poverty and obscurity, living under an assumed name in New York's Greenwich Village. Driscoll's death went unnoticed by the world for years, his grave unmarked and his legacy quietly fading. But those who look closely know his disappearance wasn't only about loss. It was a refusal to let Hollywood dictate his ending. In stepping away, even if painfully, Bobby Driscoll became a ghost story of fame, proof that sometimes privacy isn't just a choice, but a final act of self-preservation. Montgomery Clift. Few actors of the 1940s and 1950s burned as intensely as Montgomery Clift. With performances in A Place in the Sun, From Here to Eternity, and The Misfits, Clift brought an emotional honesty that helped usher in a new era of screen acting. Yet fame came at a price. Clift's beauty and sensitivity made him a target for endless tabloid speculation, especially as he shunned Hollywood's social circuit and refused to fit the studio mold. A devastating car accident in 1956 left him physically and emotionally scarred, deepening his sense of isolation. In the years that followed, Clift pulled away from publicity, rarely granting interviews and keeping only a close-knit group of friends. He would vanish for weeks at a time, seeking refuge from the limelight in quiet hotel rooms or anonymous city streets. On set, he remained a committed artist, but as soon as the cameras stopped, he melted into the background, rarely attending premieres or seeking awards. Though he continued to work until his untimely death, Clift's real withdrawal was psychological, a gradual retreat from a world that had always felt alien. In the end, his privacy became a fortress and a prison, but it allowed him to protect what was left of himself. To Hollywood, Clift was a lost leading man. To those who loved him, he was a soul who valued truth over applause. Ingrid Bergman. Ingrid Bergman's flight from Hollywood was less a vanishing act than an exile, one she chose and endured. As the luminous star of Casablanca, Gaslight, and Notorious, Bergman was adored by audiences and studios alike. She brought intelligence and grace to every role, earning comparisons to Garbo and Dietrich. But when she fell in love with Italian director Roberto Rossellini, scandal erupted. Her affair and subsequent marriage to Rossellini was a sensation, condemned by the press, church, and even the U.S. Senate. Shunned by Hollywood, Bergman left America behind, building a new life and career in Italy. For years, she refused American interviews and kept her private world fiercely guarded, even as her artistry continued to flourish abroad. Though she eventually returned to the U.S. and reclaimed her place on screen, there was always a sense of distance, a determination not to let the industry define her identity or happiness. Bergman's self-imposed exile made her a mythic figure. She had the rare courage to endure public outrage in exchange for personal authenticity. In time, Hollywood begged for her return, but her reputation had been forever changed, not just by scandal, but by her insistence on living life by her own script, not the one the studios wrote for her. Gladys Cooper. Gladys Cooper was never the archetypal Hollywood starlet, but her career spanned over 6 decades and bridged continents. She came to film stardom after already establishing herself as a grande dame of the British stage. In movies like Now Voyager and My Fair Lady, she brought elegance and authority, earning 3 Oscar nominations. But unlike many who flocked to Los Angeles for the glamour and exposure, Cooper always kept her distance. She regarded Hollywood as a means to an end, not a destination. As she aged, Cooper refused to play the fame game, declining most interviews and social invitations, and rarely indulging in the self-promotion expected of her peers. When the studio system changed and roles grew scarce, Cooper quietly retreated from the public scene, returning to her beloved England and the more intimate, rewarding world of the theater. She continued to act, but on her terms, and spent her last years surrounded by family and close friends, far from the flashbulbs and gossip of Hollywood. Cooper's retreat was not an act of defeat, but one of wisdom. She saw the traps of stardom and slipped past them, living out her days with dignity and privacy intact. In the end, she was remembered not only for her talent, but for the grace with which she walked away from the world's stage. Ruth Roman. In the golden age of Hollywood, Ruth Roman was a striking presence, sophisticated, strong-willed, and impossible to ignore. With her dark eyes and classic beauty, Roman climbed the studio ranks through the 1940s and 50s, starring in films like Strangers on a Train, Champion, and The Window. Audiences admired her resilience on screen, but the real Ruth Roman was even more determined behind the scenes. Hollywood was a world of expectations, gossip, and endless scrutiny. Roman felt its pressures keenly. While she worked steadily, she was never fully comfortable in the social whirl of premieres and parties. After a string of successful roles, Roman quietly began to step back. By the 1960s, she'd moved away from the glare of Hollywood, taking fewer film parts and focusing on her personal life. She found solace in family and the simple pleasures of ordinary days, far removed from the relentless spotlight. She appeared on television now and then, but the days of red carpets and magazine covers were behind her. Unlike those who sought dramatic comebacks, Roman faded into privacy with remarkable grace. For her, leaving Hollywood wasn't about failure or bitterness. It was about reclaiming herself. Her later years were spent mostly out of sight, remembered by those who truly knew her, not for the roles she played, but for the quiet dignity with which she left the stage. Kay Francis. There was a time in the 1930s when Kay Francis was the highest paid actress at Warner Brothers, her sultry voice and regal bearing setting her apart in an industry obsessed with youth and glamour. She headlined dozens of films, from Trouble in Paradise to One Way Passage, often playing women of elegance and hidden sorrow. Frances was admired for her style, her wit, and the unflappable poise she brought to each role. But beneath the gloss, she was all too aware of Hollywood's fickle nature. As the years passed and the industry shifted, Frances found herself cast aside by the same system that once celebrated her. Rather than cling to fading fame, she made a deliberate retreat. By the mid-1940s, she'd stopped seeking roles and stopped granting interviews. She slipped away from the studio scene, refusing to trade on nostalgia or take demeaning parts. Friends remembered her as intensely private, her correspondence often going unanswered, her whereabouts closely guarded. Frances spent her final decades in near seclusion, rarely venturing into public, content with quiet routines and personal interests. The town that once adored her largely forgot, but she seemed not to mind. Kay Frances's disappearance was a lesson in self-respect, her legacy enduring not in gossip columns, but in the dignity of knowing when to let go. Dolores Del Rio. Dolores Del Rio was not just a Hollywood star, she was a symbol of cross-cultural glamour, a Mexican beauty who conquered the American screen in the 1920s and 30s with films like Flying Down to Rio and Ramona. Del Rio's grace and charisma made her a favorite among directors, and her transition from silent pictures to talkies was seamless. Yet, as the industry evolved, so did its attitude toward actresses of color. Facing increasingly limited roles and tired of being cast as the exotic other, Del Rio chose to return to her roots. In the early 1940s, at a point when many would have fought to stay visible, she moved back to Mexico. There, she became a leading figure in the country's golden age of cinema, acting in classics like Maria Candelaria and shaping the very industry she helped build. Del Rio was fiercely protective of her privacy, giving few interviews and refusing the Hollywood comeback offers that periodically came her way. She lived out her days surrounded by artists, writers, and friends, far from the paparazzi. Her home was a sanctuary, her life her own. In stepping away from Hollywood, Dolores Del Rio did more than save her peace. She redefined what it meant to be an artist on her own terms, remembered for her integrity as much as her beauty. Gene Tierney. Gene Tierney was the very picture of 1940s Hollywood glamour. Her luminous beauty and haunting vulnerability made her unforgettable in classics like Laura, Leave Her to Heaven, and The Ghost and Mrs. Muir. But beneath the surface, Tierney's life was marked by tragedy and struggle. The relentless pressure of stardom collided with personal heartbreak when her first child was born with severe disabilities, a consequence, Tierney believed, of an ill fan breaking quarantine to meet her while she was pregnant. The guilt and grief never left her. Tierney continued to dazzle on screen, but behind closed doors, she battled severe depression and mental illness. By the late 1950s, the toll was overwhelming. She underwent several hospitalizations, including time at the Menninger Clinic, and faced the stigma that Hollywood in those days attached to mental health. Rather than hide her pain in the limelight, Tierney made the courageous choice to step away from acting. She remarried, settled in Texas, and lived a life of quiet dignity, far from the flashbulbs in studios. Occasional film roles appeared, but the urgency for privacy always won out. In her later years, Tierney wrote a candid memoir, openly discussing her struggles, a rare act of vulnerability in an era obsessed with perfection. Her retreat from fame wasn't just about escaping Hollywood, but about finding peace. In the end, Gene Tierney's legacy is not just in the roles she played, but in her refusal to let the spotlight consume her soul. Mary Astor. Mary Astor's Hollywood story is a lesson in both survival and self-preservation. From the silent era through the golden age, she was a constant, her face and voice gracing films like The Maltese Falcon, Dodsworth, and Meet Me in St. Louis. Behind her poised exterior, Astor endured storms of scandal and heartbreak, a headline-making custody battle, personal betrayals, and the constant churn of an industry quick to discard yesterday's stars. Still, she persevered, adapting from ingenue to character actress, winning an Oscar for The Great Lie, and earning respect for her craft. But by the late 1950s, Astor had grown weary of Hollywood's demands. The roles offered to aging actresses dwindled, and she no longer felt the need to play the publicity game. In her memoirs, Astor wrote with unflinching honesty about the cost of fame and the deep longing for authenticity. She left Hollywood behind, finding solace in a quiet cottage in California, surrounded by her books and garden, rarely giving interviews and declining most public appearances. She even turned to writing novels, finding a new voice outside of acting. For Astor, privacy was a conscious, protective act, a way to reclaim her life after decades on display. Her legacy is not just in her iconic roles, but in her determination to write her own final chapter, away from the noise and demands of Hollywood. In the end, the brightest stars are often the ones who choose to vanish, leaving only a trace of mystery shimmering behind them. These legends proved that true greatness isn't measured by endless applause, but by the courage to walk away and reclaim their own stories. As Hollywood spotlights fade, their quiet disappearances linger, reminding us that sometimes the boldest act of all is to simply step into the shadows and embrace a life untouched by fame.